I am a landscape architect, and so today I am obliged to show you some incredibly beautiful landscapes. Some of them you might have seen in pictures, some of them you might have even traveled to, but what I wanted to do today was tell you a mythology that I wrote about how incredibly important these landscapes are to each and every one of us. This is one of these incredible landscapes. So myth comes from the ancient Greek word mythos, and it means story of the people, and myths have guided mankind for millennia. One of the most important myths that travels through all different indigenous cultures is that humans are part of nature. For some reason, we've come to see that we're separate from nature, but indigenous cultures just believe that we are one with nature, and also that our primary traditional role is to be the custodians of nature. However, about 400 years ago, intellectuals of the European Enlightenment constructed a mythology of technology that separated humans from nature. This mythology of technology, it feasted on the felling of forests and the extraction of resources to fuel the age of industrialization. And this mythology separated humans from nature. And so this is the legacy that we're left with. The mythology of the dominant global culture focuses on either conquering nature in the name of progress or saving nature in the name of conservation. And what happens is we get wrapped up in this contest between either thinking we have this superiority complex or this savior complex. However, humanity's real role is actually not to save nature, but it's to remember how to work with nature once again. So responding to this challenge is Lo-TEK. It's a movement that considers local communities and their technologies as an evolutionary extension of life in symbiosis with nature. And so my research into this topic, it actually began maybe 2 years ago in my second year of architecture school. And I took a course called Aboriginal Environments. And this is one of the systems that we studied in that course. This is called the Brerawina fish traps. And it's 1/3 of a mile long, and it sits on this rocky shelf in a bend on the Barwon River in Australia. And it's made up of these large and small rocks, which you can see in this survey that's from 1906, and they're placed very specifically to create pools so that when the water comes through, it takes fish and water into these pools, and they're trapped so that people can just come and fish by hand. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen this image before. Maybe a show of hands to tell me if you've ever seen this image before. I see one hand, really? All right, I believe you. So this is one of the oldest human-made structures on Earth. It dates back 40,000 years, and it's pretty shocking that something that no one really recognizes. And it's these types of innovations that aren't really in our typical architectural educations, or they're not part of popular culture. We tend to focus on these innovations from dead cultures. So you know what this is. It's the 4,000-year-old pyramids of Giza. Now, the problem with that, and I'm not saying that this isn't an incredible feat of architecture. The problem that I have with this is that we fail to recognize the incredible indigenous innovations of living ancient cultures who symbiotically support 80% of the world's global biodiversity. And they do this through their knowledge, through their land management and practices, through their worldview, and through their technologies. And so in the 21st century, humankind's impact on the Earth is causing the 6th mass extinction. We all know that. This is very well known public knowledge. But I actually don't think that the 21st century is going to be remembered as the era when we lost so much biodiversity. I think when we move forward, the 21st century is going to be remembered as the century when we lost the most valuable technology that we have for climate change because we didn't even realize that it was technology. Because those same forces that are driving this sixth mass extinction on the Earth, they're also driving the extinction of these technologies. And so these are the technologies that I wrote about in the book Lo-TEK, designed by Radical Indigenism. And so Lo-TEK actually questions the dominant mythology of technology which threatens our planet and shows how humans can live with nature, live and thrive with nature. And it shows how we can fulfill that traditional role of being the custodians of all life on this planet. It questions what we consider technology and asks whether some of the most sustainable technologies were actually arrived at and evolved a millennia ago by traditional communities. And these are the innovations that have been evolved and they've been passed down and they've been perfected and adapted and changed through many, many generations. And they've done this in response to fire and flood and water scarcity and food scarcity and sea level rise and really severe storm events. Recognize any of these things? They're all the things that are actually still happening today. And they're incredibly well adapted to their environments. And they're incredibly resilient. They actually support biodiversity. And so, next question. Who recognizes the word low-tech? That's good. That's great. Well, if you don't recognize it, don't worry. It's because I made it up. It's actually a combination of two different words, local and TEK. And TEK stands for traditional ecological knowledge. But it's also kind of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek provocation to our biases towards Indigenous communities and their technologies. Because seriously, until Lo-TEK, every book that I had read, they called this technology low, L-O-W-T-E-C-H. And the definition of low-tech, this L-O-W, is really sort of unsophisticated, primitive technology. And these technologies are none of those things. These technologies are actually incredibly sophisticated and they include all of today's sustainability principles like low cost, low embodied energy, and low impact. And so low-tech, I think, actually even goes beyond sustainable. And because rather than these sort of closed loops that we talk about with sustainability, it has continuous flows, it's exponentially generative. And interestingly, they're mostly governed by these incredibly democratic collaboratives and cooperatives of communities. And so Lo-TEK uses TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, which is something you're probably not familiar with, but the definition of that is it's a cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And I think that last word is incredibly important, your belief system. And TEK could be actually understood, it's sort of, that's ambiguous. You know, how can technology be about knowledge, practice, and beliefs? Well, this is the way we explain it. We explain it as the individual is at the head of this concept of TEK. Underneath that is your understanding of your land and your species. And then beneath that, it's how you treat your land, how you manage your land, how you manage your resources. And then underneath that, it's your social institutions, who you have access to, who you can influence, who can participate in things with you, like what design can do. And underneath that, it's your worldview. And what's so interesting is there are thousands of different worldviews and that thousands of different ways that people think about how humans connect with nature. There's not just one. So Radical Indigenism, which the byline of the book is designed by Radical Indigenism, I did not make that up. This is a philosophy of Professor Eva Marie Gooch. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And she says that Radical Indigenism is when you go back and you look at Indigenous philosophies and stories and knowledge, and you think about how you can recontextualize that to be for the present, for new innovation, and create new knowledge for today. So inspired by her writings, I took this concept and I applied it to sustainability and resilience. And I thought, why don't we look at traditional knowledge, traditional systems, local technologies, and think about how that can influence what we're doing for sustainability and for climate resilience. And as a designer who's practiced for 20 years and taught for 12 years, I will attest that a technology that's embedded in a community and its environment is far more resilient than a technology that's applied to an environment. And that technology can usually scale, and it's very well adapted to scale. So Lo-TEK is a movement about building that understanding of knowledge, technology, and local solutions to generate new sustainable climate resilient solutions. And so rather than just continuing this really narrow view of technology that's informed by our distance from nature, we must acknowledge that the US Eurocentric view, the mythology of technology, it's just one way for humankind to progress, and there are other ways. And what we need really is this new mythology of technology that's informed by low-tech indigenous innovations like these. So this is the living root bridges of the Khasi and Meghalaya. And so overlooking the plains of Bangladesh, the Khasi live in a landscape that receives the most rainfall of any place on Earth. And so during the monsoon season, travel between villages is cut off as this rain just sweeps through this landscape. And so you can't get from village to village. So what they did, they arrived at this idea of growing bridges. And this amazing living bridging innovation occurred. And these are the only living bridges, or the only bridges that are able to withstand these really incredibly strong monsoonal rains that just flood through this landscape. And so this is a diagram from the book. It shows you how these living bridges are constructed. And it's created by guiding and growing living tree roots that hang from the secondary limbs of this Ficus elastica tree through a bamboo frame and then planting them on the other side of the river. And so this is a 1,500-year-old tradition. There are 74 previously. They lost 3 bridges a month ago. There's now 71 bridges. They take about 50 years to grow, and they usually last for centuries. And so multiple generations of Khasi men actually construct these bridges. And they, as I said, they construct this sort of bamboo, and then they reach the other side with the roots, and then they grow stronger as the roots go into the other side of the river, and then the tree root continues to grow. So this is a living, breathing, transpiring entity. So a second technology is the Altala Islands of the Medan in Iraq. And this is actually an islanding and housing technology that's made from a single species of reed, which you can see growing here. It's called the Kasab reed. And the Medan, they make these islands in several ways, but this diagram just shows one way that they make these islands. They create a fence around these living reeds, then on top of that they pile dried reeds and mud until they create a floating platform. And the reason this platform floats is because it's decomposing. And so there's little bubbles that are being created in this platform, which keeps this platform buoyant. And the arched houses that you can see here, they're called mutif. So we've seen in Sumerian Uruk imagery these types of houses. And Sumerian Uruk imagery is like 6,500 years old. So we know that these houses and this technology of construction is 6,500 years old. So just going back, 4,000-year-old pyramids, 6,500-year-old floating island technology, people who are living in a wet aquatic environment on these houses and islands. And so as you can see in this clip, this reed, it's actually pretty incredible. As an architect, I'm blown away by it. They use it for every single thing. They feed it to their water buffalo, they make flour to make bread for themselves, but they also use this reed to create these biodegradable, floating, buoyant islands that they construct in as little as 3 days. And this dry reed is so versatile as a building material. It can be bundled into these incredible columns that are counterweighted to create these arched houses. It then bundled in to form the roofs, the roof beams. It's then woven into the floors and into the walls and into the roof. And then this is the kicker. They twist it into a twine that they wrap around the building so that they don't have to use any nails to actually build this structure. And these Madan villages, they stay afloat for about 25 years. So that's a really incredibly long life cycle for even a building. Last example I want to show you is the Subak of Bali. And so this is the landscape that you see, but underneath this landscape, the whole island of Bali is honeycombed with these water transfer tunnels that's taking water from the rivers up the top down to these actual watersheds and these rice terraces. And the Balinese term for Subak, it actually applies to this big watershed, but also applies to the farmers, and they have this self-governing farming cooperatives. There's about 1,200 of them, and they control and synchronize both their planting and their watering techniques. And so this traditional Subak rice paddy, they're thought to be the most biodiverse and productive landscapes on Earth. And the way that they get pesticides and the way they get fertilizer is actually through a completely natural process, following cycles and manipulating water and burning regimes and just getting the minerals leaching out from the landscape and from the mountains above. And they have produced rice like this for thousands of years in those exact same terraces. And what the farmers do, they just change their water cycles, and that increases the yield tenfold. And so this Subak actually transformed this really rugged terrain, which before you could not farm on, into an incredibly productive landscape. But that's not all that it does. It actually grows food at the bottom of the food web, so it feeds avian, aquatic, terrestrial animals. It's an incredibly important storehouse for food, for migrating birds, for habitat for different species, and it's really important to global biodiversity. And so they have this scale and steepness of a skyscraper, and these terraces are now considered one of the most important landscapes on Earth. And they act as these massive absorption and purification systems, and where you get all these nutrients pooling and these biodiversity storehouses. So now I want to take you forward to 2040, to a project that I just did that opened at the Barbican, where we're looking at how these technologies can be hybridized using the idea of Lo-TEK into a technology for the future. So the ideas for this recent commission, which was at the Barbican, and it's called Our Time on Earth, the exhibition, is to really open up new conversations. So I connected engineers from Bureau Happold, who I worked with 3 of the communities that I worked with, to really think about how do we hybridize these technologies for the future.
Myself, today when I walk on a root bridge, my gratitude goes to my ancestors. So whether we can catalyze a root bridge to be completed within 20 years is another question altogether, because it does not only involve maybe bioengineering of sorts, but it also involves all many other factors that are there in the environment or in the universe.
Joining you from my car all the way from Iraq. So the islands are made mostly out of reeds, and the reeds are hollow on the inside. If the soil is not good enough to hold the column in place, the foreman would go about excavating the soil and then using the water buffalo to compact the soil in small layers.
They need more water. They borrow water. Literally, what happens is they ask a couple of weirs up to their people who they don't know, and they say, send us more water now and we'll pay you back next year by allowing you to change your irrigation cycle and taking more of our water in the next cycle.
So what we're trying to actually do here is start to create that playbook for how Western designers can start to work with Indigenous knowledge keepers and what type of future technologies could be created from that. And so This is a multimedia piece that has these projection mappings on scaled models. It has videos taken from all the workshops that we had. It has real life earth samples. It has photography. It has imagery, you name it. We had it. So it just opened a month ago, and it developed these 3 new technologies that we will think about applying in our urban environment. But this really interesting 4th technology emerged, which is what's written on the screen here. It's a legal technical innovation that's protecting the Indigenous intellectual property of the community. We called it an SOOU, which is a Smart Oath of Understanding. So now I'm going to show you a couple of the technologies on the scaled models that we developed. So this is the technology that actually inspired by the workshops with the Kasi community. And this is actually a canopy that grows over the city as the city grows, and it reduces urban heat island effect, it increases biodiversity, and creates a really nice microclimatic condition for walking. This is the technology that was inspired by the Madan, and it's basically a floating island technology so that instead of retreating when waters rise, we can raise up housing and place them on a biodegradable floating island. And this is a technology that was inspired by the Subak. It's a water sharing system that would allow for different grades of water to be cleaned through nature-based water technologies, and a cooperative to be set up by the community so that water sharing at different grades of cleanliness can work its way through the community. And so this was the SOOU, the Smart Oath of Understanding. It was read by the CEO of Bureau Happold. He read it to each member, expert, knowledge keeper of the community. They responded in their Indigenous language, accepting the terms and conditions of the SOOU. The SOOU was spoken because oral transmission is the way knowledge is actually given by communities. And so it was trying to realign sort of an asymmetrical engagement that happens with contracts when you're working with Indigenous communities to try and remove the exploitation extraction that we know has happened in biotech and biomedical. So Lo-TEK is a movement seeding creativity in crisis, inspired by technologies born from the climate extremes that we're experiencing. And as we're drowning in this age of information, while starving for wisdom, we need a new mythology of technology. And one that isn't grounded in superiority or a savior complex. We need a mythology about connecting with nature, informed by thousands of years of knowledge of people who don't even have a word for nature in their language, because they just don't think that we're separate from it. And so this statistic is, you've seen it before, but it is no accident. This is the culmination of thousands of years of working with your environment, of collecting knowledge, of managing your environment, and of supporting that. And remembering the single most important role as humans is to protect all other forms of life. And so the mythology of technology that came from the Enlightenment was wrong. Humans are not separate from nature. And our collective new mythology must be about working and designing in symbiosis with nature. It's a symbiosis. It's a collaboration. It's a relationship with a common benefit. And if we protect ourselves and we protect all other life, it's a common benefit. Thank you.